You want to join me here? Won't you be seated, please, ladies and gentlemen? Come on, Dr. Jaffe and Mr. Krogh, Mr. Ehrlich. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive, dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled.
The video I just showed you was President Nixon declaring the war on drugs. This is going to be the antithesis of this video. It is going to be mostly what it is about, but first we're going to end up starting right after slavery ends. But in general, the war on drugs and the Nixon administration was the starting point of our modern understanding and our modern racism that we have it nowadays, where it is not blatant, it is something that rather we see as systematic. With that being said, I am going to describe what the war on drugs is and all of that from here. And I'd also like to say, because I have recorded this a few times, all my mentions of President Reagan are meant to be Nixon. The war on drugs is a global campaign which is led by the United States federal government of drug prohibition, military aid, and military intervention with the aim of reducing the illegal drug trade in the United States. And one of the ways in which this was carried out was what was called tough on crime policies, which were really enacted by Ronald Reagan. He was the start of these tough on crime policies. And if there's any way to define tough on crime, it is with one sentence, which is judge, one who denies all such relief. And that's what describes these set of laws that were passed during the 1980s by Ronald Reagan. These set of laws nowadays have been subject to much criticism, such as being called racist, because they are. I'm going to explain why they're racist, because that's the big one. I'm going to explain why they're racist in the video. And first, we're going to start with a little information to warm up to the effects of these and what were these laws. And to start off the video, I'm going to start off saying the United States has the highest amount of our population incarcerated in any country, which is 655 people for every 100,000 people, which is nearly 1% of our population is currently living out their lives in prison. We also have one of the highest re-incarceration rates in the world, meaning people who get out of prison and then go right back to prison. Along with this, the United States is 4% of the world population, as most of us should know, yet we actually hold 25% of the world's prisoners. And that's a problem. And the question is, why are we going and facing that problem, which I'm going to explain in this video. And first, I think that it starts with actually the abolition of slavery. Slavery does still have effects today, but right now we're just going to be focusing on what we did after to try and combat it and how the United States completely trashed our response and how our response was it was just trash. I mean, that's the only way how I know how to describe our response to ending slavery and how we did it. And of course, the end of slavery starts with the 13th Amendment, which just pay attention to the 13th Amendment here because you're going to see what this causes later. But the 13th Amendment says that to the United States Constitution, abolish slavery and voluntary servitude except as punishment for a crime, meaning if you commit a crime, suddenly you can be a slave. Being a slave can be your punishment. Involuntary servitude can be your punishment. And this 13th Amendment, this part of the 13th Amendment, actually hasn't even been abolished. We've even seen in cases such as Louisiana, recently there was a vote where this was on the ballot, and people did not vote to abolish that part of the 13th Amendment, which is utterly crazy that they're like, oh, well, slavery's okay as punishment for a crime. That's all right. And yeah, that's not too good. And at the end of slavery, it generally left African Americans off in a worse position, which we can all agree on. Any sane person can agree that African Americans were left off in a worse position because they didn't have the resources to start a proper life. They weren't given anything. They were just plopped on the street. They just plopped on the street right outside of the plantation. There you go, you're free, have fun. Because slave owners don't really want to help their slaves if their slaves aren't their slaves anymore. They viewed them as property. Keep that in mind. And what we saw after slavery ended was things called black codes and Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws do come into play a little later. First, it starts with the black codes. And black codes were designed to keep black labor cheap and available after the Civil War, meaning for business owners being able to employ black people for, of course, cheap labor, as I just said. Everybody's heard about the Jim Crow laws. That one's pretty self-explanatory. They're just designed to keep black people separated from white people because white people felt that blacks were inferior. Now, the black codes effectively kept black people from being able to make as much money, and it did things such as what were called vagrancy laws, which is it made not having a place to stay at night, not having a home, illegal. And it's also been called vagabond laws. And it makes, if you don't have a home, that's illegal. If you don't have property to stay on at night, that's illegal. You've broken the law now. Keep in mind, 13th Amendment says once you've broken the law, one of the punishments can be slavery. So due to not having any property, they inherently became criminals. And once you become a criminal, and this is even still now, you can't vote anymore. You lose your right to vote. So most black people immediately lost their right to vote once they came out of slavery because they didn't have property. So they were breaking the law by being a vagabond. And also due to that, they would be put in prison or arrested and then given off to somebody to do slavery as punishment for a crime, which is terrible. And so effectively, if black people wanted to avoid getting caught by vagabond laws, which anybody would have to avoid it at that point, is they would have to move in back with their previous slave owner and accept food, clothing, and shelter as payment, because everybody knows, or at this time everybody would have known, they won't accept much pay. Like, it's okay to not give them much pay because they'll accept anything because they just want a place to stay. Like, they just need a place to stay, and I can take advantage of them for that. There's no cars, so they can't go drive around and get a longer range of what jobs are available. There's just me, just their slave owner. So there was a big case of slaves having to just go back and live with the very same master who had whipped them, sexually abused them, cases such as that, because they weren't given much other option, because if they didn't live with them, then they were committing a crime, then they'd get arrested, and then they couldn't vote. Whereas at least if they just went back directly, they could still vote. And then slave owners would do things like not allow them to go vote. But this process ended up being called neo-slavery, which is kind of like how you hear neoconservatism, neoliberalism, which I've talked about, neo-fascism. It just means that it is basically a spin-off. It's an offshoot of that set of beliefs. And in this case of slavery, neo-slavery, there's not really a definition on it, but I think that it's best defined as systematically oppressing somebody to the degree where working is not a choice and it is nearly impossible to leave their current socioeconomic position. Along with this, black people after the Civil War had ended and after slavery had been abolished faced something called redlining. Redlining can be defined as a discriminatory practice that consists of the systematic denial of services, such as mortgages, insurance loans, and other financial services to residents of a certain area based on their race or ethnicity. Redlining disregards individuals' qualifications and creditworthiness to refuse such services solely based on the residency of those individuals in minority neighborhoods, which were also quite often deemed hazardous or dangerous. And what happened in redlining was banks would go through, and this is basically their form of a credit check, except it's extremely racist. And banks would go through towns and they would mark down the families that are living there. So they'd mark down how much white families are living there. They'd mark down how much African American families are living there. They'd mark down how much Latino families are living there. And then, in quotations, totally not related to that, they would assign a color. So you'd see green, yellow, or red. Green means it's a good score and it's safe to give a mortgage of any way, an insurance loan of any way, any other financial service. Green means it's completely safe. They're going to be a safe investment. Red means it's going to be terrible. Don't do it. Yellow means don't give them too much money. And that's what we see. And that, of course, is going to put them in a worse position because it is completely related to race. Because it ended up being completely related to race. Like, you look back in it now and it's like, oh, just the moment that black populations rise, suddenly red comes in. That's weird. The moment one African American family lives here, it becomes yellow. This also made it so that black people and African Americans too at this time wouldn't be able to get mortgages for cars, houses, or healthcare. And so the reason why they need a mortgage for a house is because most of the time they're renting those properties there already because they just came out of slavery. So yeah, and they're not going to be able to move and pay less rent because they can't get a mortgage because they're in the red zone. And the issue about not having cars is they can't drive to a job, so they have a very narrow selection of jobs, which are already going to be paying much different from if you can just drive 10 miles away, because what those companies are selling that are by them, or what those jobs are selling rather, is going to be low wages, selling things at low cost, sometimes slightly high costs, but it will always be low cost because the business owners know they can take advantage of the people because there is no place else that the people can end up going because they don't have cars, and the United States hasn't, and most likely won't have adequate infrastructure for citizens. And then they also had the issue with healthcare, which encounters a whole different shebang of issues. So moment there's a medical issue and they have to go to the hospital, it's not even that they'll be in debt for the rest of their life. They can't get a loan, so they will just be screwed. They can't get help. And even white people in those neighborhoods too face discrimination, not in the sense of people treating them worse directly, but in the sense of when there was an African American family living there, it would be designated as yellow if it was mixed. And so those white people too would get worse benefits, not benefits at all, just they would receive just as bad issues too, which is a big issue also. This may not sound important, but most of the high-paying jobs are going to be in different parts of the city. And this is further elaborating on the cars, such as now you see in modern-day Chicago, the residential areas tend to be much farther from the main part of the city, even though everybody knows that the main part of the city would definitely pay more. For anybody who can't get a car, they're screwed and they're stuck in the low-paying area, which is where they live. And this is what also led to the start of hoods, purely because we effectively segregated black people and African Americans into their own area of cities. Because they couldn't get cars to drive to other parts of the cities. They couldn't get mortgages to buy houses in the cities. They couldn't get health care. So they were just screwed. They were just stuck there and they couldn't do anything. And that's where the start of hoods and ghettos starts. It's even before Jim Crow became the big issue. It was just built in inherently. Even though some people do consider redlining Jim Crow, I would say it's a little before the direct, like, you can't use this drinking fountain because it's not okay. And then, of course, we saw the societal oppression of any black leaders for social movements by Even the US government, such as the FBI head at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, said that they needed to stop the rise of what he called a Black Messiah. And these practices, and redlining in particular, actually continued up until 1968. When the FBI said these things, it led to the death of somebody who goes by the name Fred Hampton. I think I've already talked about that, but that happened in Chicago. He was a Black Panther Party leader at the time. This led to the death of Malcolm X, who is a Muslim, or who was a Muslim communist leader at the time, and then Martin Luther King Jr., who was a socialist reverend fighting for civil rights. Everybody knows who Martin Luther King Jr. is. Then after all of those deaths, the main issue arises where we just start to see the war on drugs, which is also going to be tough on crime. That's why I'm saying main issue. This is what the video is about, not over summarizing. So one of the first things we see with the tough on crime era is what is called mandatory minimums. And that started with, of course, Reagan. And what mandatory minimums are defined as is sentence created by Congress or a state legislator which the court must give to a person convicted of a crime. That means no matter what, even if the person repented, whatever, no matter, even if the person had the literal minimum, that means you have to give that mandatory minimum. Even if they're a great person and it was for a good reason, it says, well, you had that minimum, so we have to give you our minimum sentence too. And this led to huge discrimination in Black neighborhoods, such as there was the whole crisis and scare of drugs, which really just targeted African Americans, such as in cases of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. One, inherently, if you are a boomer, let's just ask any boomer, ask anybody who's over the age of 40. Ask them which is worse, crack cocaine or powder cocaine. They will always tell you that crack cocaine is worse. Reason being is because the Reagan administration made that a big platform for them. They talked about how bad crack cocaine was. They talked about how many issues it had, when in reality we've discovered now that it doesn't have much issues. But this led to crack cocaine actually having 100 times the punishment of powder cocaine. Now, that doesn't sound like too big an issue. It just sounds unfair, but you don't know why it targets the Black population yet. The reason why it targets the Black population is because it was cheaper to buy, and it was cheaper, it was cheaper to buy because it was easier to produce, and therefore it spread in the cities more easily. Whereas powder cocaine was used majority by white people, and there was less scaring around it. There was less fear around it. It was more just like, oh, he does cocaine. Wow. Okay. But then when it's crack cocaine, that was a big deal. People saw that as, oh, dangerous, because they had already connected this idea that like Black people are dangerous. And that's a big issue that we're going to see. And so, for instance, if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, it's a 5-year minimum jail sentence. Minimum. They literally, legally cannot give you anything less than that. Whereas if you had powder cocaine, you would need 500 grams to send yourself to prison, which is utterly for the same amount of time, which is utterly crazy. I think we both can agree on that, or we all can agree on that. And that law was carried up until 2010. So chances are, not just chances, but there are people who are roaming around now who that law affected them in their life. There are people who would have gotten out in 2015 who that law put them in jail. Even after it was abolished, it was still, well, that was the sentence. Also, with the Reagan administration, we see these things called no-knock warrants. No-knock warrants are defined as a no-knock warrant is a warrant issued by a judge that allows law enforcement to enter a property without immediate prior notification of the residents, such as by knocking or ringing a doorbell. In most cases, law enforcement will identify themselves just before they forcefully enter the property. It is issued under the belief that any evidence they hope to find may be destroyed between the time that the police identify themselves and the time they secure the area, or in the event where there is a large perceived threat to officer safety during the execution of the warrant. No-knock warrants and I will describe what those are too. But they have led to the death of people such as Breonna Taylor, which we all are aware of the name Breonna Taylor. We all have heard it. It led to protests, very big protests, which I would say are important in recent American history. And what no-knock warrants were and what they did was the officers, if they suspected a house of having any sort of illegal substance, and this mainly targeted drugs, this mainly targeted marijuana, just something as simple as marijuana, crack cocaine. They go to a judge, they tell the judge. And then, of course, the judges are biased, so they're not going to be like, oh, can you show me a lot of evidence? They're just going to be like, well, why do you think that? And then the cop is going to be like, well, it smells like it. Well, they looked high earlier, which you already know white people at this time are racially profiling hard, and they still are, but way harder as a cops specifically. And then the judge is going to be like, oh, well, why do you think that? And they're going to be like, well, he smelled like it. He looked like it. And the judge is going to say, okay, you can go take a no-knock warrant, which then uses military equipment to enter somebody's house. Most of the time you use a SWAT team with no-knock warrants. So it's people with assault rifles, automatic weapons, ready to just tear through the whole place, even though you're busting down somebody's door most of the time at night. So you're just showing up out of nowhere and you expect them not to fight back when they don't even know who you are. So it leads to the death of many African American people purely because somebody bursts into their house, they hear it, they get up, they grab a gun, they shoot. Because somebody just bursts in their house and you just hear footsteps everywhere. No warning, nothing. Or even if you just get up, suddenly it is threatening. That's what led to Breonna Taylor's death. That's what led to her unfair death. It was these terrible no-knock warrants, which are like, hey, basically being black and getting up from your bed is now illegal. But also, if you stay in your bed, it's illegal because, like, that's how we killed Fred Hampton. So, yeah, that's a terrible issue, really. And believe it or not, we did not see directly racist laws when it came to tough on crime end here, because it is an era that started with Reagan, but I don't even think it has ended, because we have seen modern cases such as Biden recently saying that the Democrats are tough on crime and trying to act like that's a good thing, even though being tough on crime has been shown that it is a terrible thing, really. But we saw famous laws that were racist and tough on crime actually passed by New York mayor during the time of 9/11, Rudy Giuliani. And these laws were known as stop and frisk. What stop and frisk gave was it gave police the right to just, while they're walking on the sidewalk, look at somebody, and if they think that person is suspicious in any way, they can frisk them. So they can search them, pat them down right in the street. If they find anything, arrest them right there, of course. Which doesn't sound too discriminatory until you realize, first, there's racial profiling. And I mean, that's pretty much it. There's going to be racial profiling. It's not that black people commit more crimes than white people. It's that black people are targeted more than white people. So if they start to look at more black people, which they did, and I'm going to get into those statistics, then they're going to be arresting more black people, and then it's just going to be biased. And so 90% of those who were stopped in 2017 with the stop and frisk laws, because they still have not ended, 90% of those who were stopped in 2017 were African American or Latino, and this was in New York. But at that time, only 54.1% of the New York population was African American or Latino. So basically 50% of the population was African American or a minority. Yet 90% of the stopped and frisked people were minorities. So you already know that the police were just using it to racially profile people. And even in modern world studies that we've seen, such as a study conducted by Stanford University, they analyzed 100 million traffic stops, and they concluded that if you are a minority, you are actually 20% more likely to get pulled over than just being white or looking white, because it was by ethnicity, not by race. Due to all these issues, we have seen now modern repercussions of it, such as black men are targeted much worse than really anybody else when it comes to violent crime in general, black men are targeted worse. And so when it came to cases such as mandatory minimums, no knock warrants, stop and frisk, this did lead to an absence of black men, and still today leads to an absence of black men in black neighborhoods. So you have a ton of racist white people walking around acting like it's poverty mindset, like, oh, they don't have any fathers because it's their culture. It's like, no, it's because the rich and white came in and were like, hey, yo, let's make laws that just discriminate black people. And there was more to it. It was, you always have to keep a poor working class so that you always have cheap labor for rich people. But it was, hey, let's create laws that disproportionately affect the poor, keep them down. And so now they don't have fathers. And so, of course, there's going to be misguidance. They're going to form gangs. That is how gangs are formed. That is why there are more gangs in poor areas. And they're not going to focus on getting more high-paying jobs, which it's okay to not focus on getting high-paying jobs, but it's not because it's their culture. It's because they were forced to be poor by what is systematically built into the law. And it's generally just terrible. We also see the effects of it in cases such as Breonna Taylor, which we already talked about, and George Floyd. In the case of George Floyd, you had the officer setting his knee on George Floyd's neck for, it's been a long time now, so if I get the time wrong, I'm going to correct it, but for about 7 minutes. Even though George Floyd wasn't even doing anything. And then the bigger issue of the whole situation was then you had white supremacists or a ton of racist crackers. I guess I have to censor that. I said something that is a food that you call white people. I'm censoring it because Twitch has been banning people for it. But you have a ton of racist white people who are like, oh, well, it's because he was high on fentanyl, or it's because he was on crack at the time, which is attached to black people and then completely racially motivated. I'm going to be showing whatever the conspiracy theories are right on the screen right now, rather than just saying, yeah, the officer was completely racially profiling George Floyd and targeting him harder than you would a white person, because that's definitely true, because way more black people are targeted than white people when it comes to situations like this. There's also been the legal system, which we just covered, disproportionately helps the rich when it comes to court and will not help the poor. Because now we do have modern credit score too, which I'm not going to say is discriminatory inherently, but it is not built to help the poor in the sense that they're not going to be able to get loans. They're not going to be able to afford a good lawyer in court, whereas the rich will. So even if the rich commit a crime, you already know that if the rich commit a crime that is the same as somebody who is poor, they will get a shorter sentence. They will get a tinier punishment. They will get something where they can avoid their punishment as much as possible. We've also seen this manifest in itself in ways such as when cops, police chiefs, things such as that, people such as that, will commit crimes, which for anybody else would be direct to prison, you're stupid, you're done, out. You just did something that was terribly wrong. And when a cop does it, suddenly it's just, oh, well, you get to take some paid time off. You get to go take a breather. It's like, whereas if a normal person does that, it's like, you are insane. You are a danger to people around you. You're done. When a cop does it, suddenly it's just, oh, well, you need to take some paid time off. And so we also see it manifest itself in ways such as that. We've seen cases such as the Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is in Angola, Louisiana, take advantage of the 13th Amendment, and they have legal slavery there. I want you right now, and I'm going to put it in the description too, look up the Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is in Angola. Look up cotton picking, look up farming, look up slavery, and you're going to see what I'm talking about, because they literally put prisoners, and all the prisoners, that's majority black, they put them right out in the fields, and they're picking cotton, and it's cheap labor. It is a private capitalist prison, and They're taking advantage of the laws to simply get cheap labor. They are dehumanizing people for what? Mandatory minimums for like crack cocaine, for marijuana, to pick cotton. They're just taking advantage of them for that reason, which is the same thing slave owners did with vagabond laws. It's the same thing that's been done before, except now it's happening in the modern world. And we also see issues like that with mindsets. Mindsets completely change, such as the BLM protests were more heavily attacked than Proud Boys or January 6th. And yes, I'm bringing in modern politics into this because it is a political issue. You can't just have a conservative walking around being like, oh yeah, well, we were racist, but we're not anymore. That's not helping anybody. Or saying, oh, well, it's the people's issue, it's not the government's issue. Well, yes, it is the government's issue. Stop being crazy. It is everybody's issue. This is something that is systematic. If it's something that's systematic, it is everybody's issue. And when I say the BLM protests are more heavily criticized, what I mean is when everybody thinks about the BLM protests, you know what they think about? They think about violence. When they think about something that's a big deal or a big threat to national security, they think about BLM. But guess what? Out of all the BLM protests, if I'm not mistaken, this statistic was taken in 2020, if not 2019, and it was by the Wall Street Journal, because I'm putting it on the screen right now. It wasn't in my notes to put this here. It was something I read a long time ago, and I'm going to be showing it right now. But 93% of the BLM protests reported no actions of violence. No circumstances of violence, not an injury, nothing like that, just a protest. Only 7% reported violence. And that 7%, that counts as an injury, that counts as one lash out, that counts as one action of vandalization. And immediately that makes it technically violent. Whereas, you know, when people think what's dangerous to the nation right now when it comes to race and things, they don't think Proud Boys, KKK, even though the town I'm in recently had KKK flyers just fly right through it about a year and a half ago. Yeah, about a year and a half ago. And it's like, but nobody ever thinks, oh, maybe the KKK is an issue, which I'm not even going to say is too big of an issue now, but I do think that the Proud Boys are. I do think that people who are crazy enough to go and try and overthrow democracy, to install a president who says that the election is fraud, I do think that's a national security threat much more than BLM, because BLM never had targeted government buildings like that, and most people try to demonize BLM in that way. We also see KKK is less heavily criticized than that of black woke communists. And what I mean by that is the KKK is incredibly minuscule. It is not a thing. It is not a big worry at all. Neither are black woke communists. All right, you're demonizing them and you don't even understand what they want, yet your beliefs reflect that of the KKK. Most white people totally agree with them. I'm just going to call the KKK whiteys from now on, because it makes it simpler for my syllables. Whereas they make black woke communists demons, even though they don't know what woke means, they don't know what communists means, and they don't even understand blackness. I'm not even going to sit here and say I completely understand blackness, but I would definitely understand it more than those people. 90% of people that aren't those people would understand it better than those people who are demonizing black woke communists, in quotations. And even on top of that, because keep in mind, I do go to school, I saw in my own school people do some skit about drugs and a drug deal, and it was just a ton of white people doing black scent. And it's seen as this culturally, like it was culturally accepted, and nobody saw a big issue with it, and it just shows that inherently people connect the idea of drugs to being black. Even though white people do drugs just as much as black people, and when it comes to things like marijuana, there's not really an issue with that. Most drugs, you know, there's not really an issue with it, but people connect this idea of being a criminal to being black. You inherently see it in every single aspect. Black people are overall just more heavily criminalized, even by our mindsets, by our government, by everything. And I don't think that there's really a way to stop this from happening. I think that there is one way, of course, and that's not that complicated, but I don't think there's just one way where we can do this if we don't all agree, or 90% of us agree, because all of us aren't going to, but a lot of us do need to agree. And I think that the only way that we can help this overall is we have to be more aware of our biases that we may face. That goes for everybody, about how Black people have been shown to us in the media by people like the government. Because such as shows like Cops, we saw this happen where cops would only, in the show Cops, it was mostly just Black people they were arresting. It was put into our mindset that Black people were criminals, and that's wrong, you know? And I think that the only way to fix this is to realize those biases. It's to face those biases. It's to realize that everybody inherently has those biases. And the only way that you can stop them is by being more aware of it. And it stinks because most people don't think like this, but I truly don't think this battle is against each other. It's not against the racist whites who are, being racist and doing their thing, or racist anybody's. It's more against this corrupt system which has been systematically oppressing Black people and has been oppressing minorities since the beginning. And white people need to realize that too. Everybody needs to realize that. And I think that the fight is against that system, rather, because that system is what is teaching the racists. They're just repeating those talking points. It's what the racists hear from Fox News. It's what the racists hear from their media. Those are the people who have orchestrated the whole situation. And there's even more to that. It's the people who have orchestrated the system are the people in need of a boogeyman. It's the people in need of cheap labor. And who do you think those people are? Who do you think the people are that have orchestrated everything? Because it's not some deep secret. I guarantee you can guess it. It's probably on the back of your mind right now. It's the people that need a distraction. It's the rich.